Hi, boys and girls. I'm going to read you chapters 5 and 6 from our flat Stanley story. Stanley found that no matter how many humps a camel may have, riding one was no joke. The camel lurched. Stanley slipped. The camel bumped. Stanley slid. He finally solved the problem by folding himself over its hump like a blanket. At last, the caravan came to a stop. There's Stanley on the camel. Stanley fell to the ground and looked up and up. Somehow pyramids had always looked a bit smaller in pictures. Sir Hawara brought Stanley around to the back and then lit a torch and handed it to him. He pointed to a space just a few inches wide between two enormous stone blocks. Remember, find the scrolls, then unlock the tomb. No dilly-dallying. Stanley stared at the dark slot between the stones. He didn't think it looked like a place he'd want to be dilly-dallying. He didn't think it looked like a place he wanted to do anything in at all. But he reminded himself that this was an important archaeological expedition, and a promise was a promise. He took a deep breath and wedged himself into the passageway. There he is. 3 inches is not very much room to get around in. Stanley had to half wiggle and half slide as he took little sideways hops just to inch along slowly. After many twists and turns in the deepest darkness, he heard a leathery flapping. He felt a rush of wind as if from a great many wings. He held up his torch, and then out of the gloom, bats. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. Stanley had disturbed a whole colony of bats, and they were coming right for him. He felt himself break into a cold sweat and a new set of goose discs. As the bats approached, Stanley leapt up and pressed himself against the stone wall, and he stuck there. Those goose discs on his arms and legs, in combination with the cold sweat, had become little suction cups. Stanley hung perfectly still, pressed tight to the pyramid wall like a starfish, until the entire flock of bats had passed by. Then, as his fear subsided, the little goose disc suction cups let go, one by one, doop, doop, and he slipped gently to the ground again. Stanley was badly shaken, but he knew he must go on. He took one sideways step, and then another, and another. Just as he was beginning to give up hope of ever finding the tomb, the passageway opened up into an arched entryway. Stanley held up his torch and gasped. He had been in several extremely fancy elevators before, so he was no stranger to beautiful places. But this was something else indeed. Bejeweled carvings of dogs and snakes guarded the entryway. Gold urns lined the walls. And the center of the room was a large casket made of gold. There's the picture of the room he's entering. And on top of that lay a life-size alabaster statue of King Khufu. There was no doubt about it. Stanley had discovered the tomb of the great pharaoh, and flanking the coffin, that means on the side, were golden pedestals and 2 enormous scrolls. He had done it. He had found the priceless giant scrolls of papyrus. Now to find the secret exit. Stanley stepped into the tomb and began to search. The walls were covered with hieroglyphs and beautiful painted scenes, but there was no door. The only thing that seemed out of place was a large button at the far end of the tomb. The button seemed strangely to call to him, as if it were saying, "Press me." Stanley did. A panel swung open to reveal a full-size passageway. Stanley stepped out to explore and held up his torch. Surely this was the passageway Sir Hawara had talked about. The one the burial party must have used. But the passageway split just ahead, and from there Stanley could see that each branch split again. How would he know which way to go to get out? Then he noticed something. At each intersection, a life-sized hieroglyph was painted on the wall. What if they were painted facing a certain way to give directions like the ones in the National Museum? Chapter 6, A Bad Surprise. Stanley closed the tomb's door behind him and set off. Following the hieroglyphs at every branch, before long he came to another button on the wall, just like the one in the tomb. He pressed it, and once again, a large panel of huge stone blocks swung open. Suddenly, Stanley stepped outside into the fresh air. Sir Hawara and his guards came rushing over when they saw Stanley. "Well," Sir Hawara demanded, hopping on one foot and then another, "the scrolls!" "I found them," Stanley told him. Suddenly he felt quite proud. He had located the priceless giant scrolls of papyrus, and now he was safely outside in the warm sunshine. "And I found the passageway out. There are lots of branches in the passageway, but all you have to do is follow the black hieroglyphs to get out." "Excellent," Sir Hawara rubbed his hands together. "I must get the crew ready. Meet me back here in the morning. At daybreak, we take the scrolls." He climbed onto his camel and rode away, leaving Stanley bewildered. That means confused. Just then, he felt a tug at his shirt. He turned to find Amisi there, glaring at him. "That's who you've been working with? That's the worst looter of Egyptian treasures in the country. My father and I have been trying to catch him red-handed for years. I guess I was wrong about you." And she stomped off. Stanley didn't know what to think. He climbed back onto his camel and followed Sir Hawara's party back to the bazaar. He was going to find out just what was going on. Back at Sir Hawara's headquarters, henchmen were everywhere. Stanley eased himself into the shadows and sneaked around to the back. He lifted the tent flap and peeked inside. It was even darker and smokier than before. Stanley took a deep breath of nice, fresh outside air. Then, using the limberness he had developed by slipping under his bedroom door at home, Stanley slipped under the flap. Sir Hawara was on his cushion, talking in a low voice. Cautiously, Stanley crept closer. "What's that in the shadows?" A guard jumped up, pointing towards Stanley. There was no place to hide. Stanley plastered himself against a large container standing upright behind him and froze. "It's nothing," said Sir Hawara, clapping his hands for silence. Just the sarcophagus. It's a very realistic painting on the cover. Quite a find. Now pay attention to my plans." Stanley held himself perfectly still and listened. You see Stanley hiding against the sarcophagus, but because he's flat, they cannot see him. "Tomorrow, we send the flat boy into the tomb to unlock it for us. We take the scrolls and pack them onto the plane I'll have waiting. We'll be out of there before anyone is the wiser. These scrolls will fetch a fortune. I'll be rich, rich, rich. And the beauty of it is all that no one will ever know they existed." So Amisi was right. They were looters who were sneakier than the worst sneak thieves, and Stanley was helping them steal one of Egypt's greatest treasures. Stanley peeled himself off the sarcophagus quietly and slid back under the tent. Then he made his way to the National Historical Museum and climbed the steps. The least he could do was admit to Amisi and her father what he had done. The entryway was crowded with tourists. Amisi and her father came in. They passed right by him. "What about a very light bulletin board?" he heard Amisi's father say. "What about a map?" "I don't think so, Father," Amisi replied. "Besides, I think that bulletin board flattened his brains. Wait until I tell you what I just found out." Stanley worked himself free from the crowd and hurried after Amisi and her father. He caught up with them at the curator's office and called out. Amisi turned and frowned at him. Then she slammed the door shut. Somehow, Stanley felt even flatter than before, as flat as the hieroglyph painted on the wall beside him. Then he had an idea that just might work. Stanley ran to the main desk and scribbled a note. "Please give this to the curator," he said. "It's urgent. Thank you very much." Then he went back to the antiquities bazaar, planning his plan. The sky was growing dark. Stanley let himself into the camel's pen and made a bed for himself by placing a stack of saddle blankets on the mound of straw and then layered himself into the stack. He closed his eyes and remembered his parents insisted he and Arthur get a good night's sleep every evening. Suddenly, Stanley missed his family. Beside him, a camel grunted and snorted. "If I were home, Arthur would be sleeping in the bed next to me right now." Arthur sometimes grunted and snorted too. But Arthur smelled better than a camel, thought Stanley fondly as he fell asleep. That's the end of chapters 5 and 6. Tomorrow, we'll start with chapter 7.